If an emperor could rule the world surrounded by 3,000 women, why would heaven collapse if a woman ruled surrounded by men? That question was not merely a whisper of rebellion. It was a dagger driven straight into the heart of the moral order that had governed imperial China for centuries. Imagine the Forbidden City, not as the polished legend presented in textbooks, not as a palace filled with delicate concubines and soft laughter behind silk curtains. Imagine instead corridors where the air smells of sandalwood and iron discipline, where the shadows moving behind embroidered screens do not belong to timid maidens, but to broad-shouldered men selected for beauty, obedience, and silence. In that world stood a single woman who dared to call herself emperor. Her name was Wu Zetian, and for nearly 20 years she ruled the largest and most sophisticated empire on earth. Wu Zetian did not simply seize power. She rewrote the rules that defined power itself. For 5,000 years, Chinese civilization had been built upon an unshakable assumption that heaven granted authority only to men. Women could influence, advise, and manipulate, but never rule. Wu Zetian shattered that belief with surgical precision. She did not merely climb to the throne. She dismantled the ladder behind her so that no one could claim it had always belonged to men. And perhaps her most controversial act was not the wars she fought or the reforms she implemented, but the way she turned the palace itself into a mirror that reflected the hypocrisy of the patriarchal world. The imperial harem had always been a symbol of male dominance. Thousands of women chosen for their beauty were gathered from across the empire to serve the emperor as pleasure and to produce heirs for the throne. Their lives were defined by waiting, by hope, and by fear. Yet Wu Zetian reversed this ancient institution with shocking audacity. Inside the private sanctuaries of the palace, there were no trembling concubines waiting for the emperor's attention. There were men, young, handsome, carefully selected men, chosen not for noble lineage, but for the symmetry of their faces, the elegance of their voices, and their ability to obey without question. They were trained, perfumed, and presented as carefully as prized horses in the imperial stables. To her enemies, this became proof of her moral corruption. To Wu Zetian, it was something far more dangerous. It was power. But before she became the most controversial ruler in Chinese history, Wu Zetian was simply a girl born into a world that had already decided what she could never become. The year was 624. China was experiencing the golden age of the Tang Dynasty, an era of dazzling cultural achievement, expanding borders, and sophisticated bureaucracy. Yet beneath that brilliance lay a rigid social order where a woman's fate was decided before she could even speak. Wu Zetian, then known as Wu Shao, was born into the family of a wealthy merchant, and she was not royalty. She was not destined for greatness. In the eyes of society, she was simply another daughter who would eventually marry, bear children, and disappear into the background of history. But Wu Zhao was not like other girls of her time. While many young women were trained in embroidery and court etiquette, she spent her days reading, hidden in the quiet corners of her father's house. She studied history, philosophy, and poetry with an intensity that surprised even the scholars who visited the family. She understood something that most adults around her did not yet recognize. Knowledge was a weapon, and in a world where women were denied swords and titles, knowledge could be sharper than any blade. At the age of 14, her life changed forever. An imperial decree arrived, ordering her to enter the palace as a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong. For her family, this was a tremendous honor. For Wu Zhao, it was something very different. The palace was not a place of luxury. It was a gilded prison where hundreds of women competed silently for the emperor's attention. Most would spend their entire lives inside those walls without ever being noticed. Their youth would fade, their hopes would wither, and their names would be forgotten. Wu Zhao entered that prison with open eyes. While the other concubines waited nervously for the emperor's favor, she studied the palace itself. She watched the ministers who whispered in corridors, the eunuchs who controlled access to power, and the silent rivalries that shaped the court's invisible hierarchy. Every gesture, every conversation, every glance carried meaning. The palace was not simply a residence, it was a battlefield where intelligence mattered more than beauty. During the reign of Emperor Taizong, Wu Zhao remained largely unnoticed. She was intelligent but cautious, observant but silent. Years passed without her gaining significant influence. Yet even in that apparent obscurity, she was learning the language of power. She memorized the weaknesses of powerful officials and the ambitions of rising courtiers. She watched how loyalty shifted like sand whenever the political winds changed. Then everything changed with the emperor's death. According to tradition, concubines who had not borne children for the emperor were sent to Buddhist monasteries for the rest of their lives. Their hair was shaved, their silk robes replaced with gray robes of renunciation. They would spend decades praying for the soul of a man who had barely noticed them. Wu Zhao was 26 years old when she was sent to such a monastery. To the outside world, her story appeared finished, but Wu Zhao had never accepted the role of a forgotten woman. Inside the monastery she waited, observed, and planned, somewhere beyond the temple walls. The new Emperor Gaozong, the son of the late Emperor Taizong, had begun to remember her. Their relationship had quietly developed before the old emperor's death, and now that memory became a spark capable of igniting a political firestorm. When Wu Zhao returned to the palace, it shocked the entire court. According to strict Confucian morality, it was almost unthinkable for a former concubine of a father to become the consort of his son. Yet the impossible happened. Wu Zhao returned not as a forgotten widow, but as the favored companion of Emperor Gaozong. From that moment onward, the palace began to change. Her rivals disappeared one by one. Some were exiled. Others were quietly removed from the political stage. The reigning empress was eventually stripped of her title, and Wu Zhao rose to the position of empress herself. Yet her ambitions extended far beyond the traditional influence granted to imperial wives. When Emperor Gaozong began to suffer from chronic illness that left him partially blind and unable to rule effectively, Wu Zhao stepped forward. At first she merely assisted him, reading documents and advising on decisions. Soon she was issuing orders in his name. Ministers who once ignored her now bowed deeply before the curtain behind which she sat. The empire had not yet realized it, but a transformation was already underway. Power was shifting from the emperor to the woman who sat beside him. And when Emperor Gaozong finally died, Wu Zetian made the decision that would change history forever. In the year 690, she declared herself Emperor of China, not Empress, not Regent. Emperor for the first and only time in 5,000 years of Chinese imperial history, a woman claimed the mandate of heaven, and the world trembled. By the time Wu Zetian formally took the throne in 690, the Temps Empire had already been reshaped by her will. Ministers who once resisted her rule had either been replaced, silenced, or converted into loyal servants of the new order. The bureaucracy that governed the empire had been reorganized so that talent mattered more than aristocratic birth. Farmers received land reforms that strengthened agricultural production, and the imperial examination system was expanded, allowing men from humble families to rise through merit rather than bloodline. To the common people, Wu Zetian's rule often brought stability and opportunity, but within the walls of the palace, a far stranger transformation was unfolding. For centuries, the imperial harem had been the ultimate symbol of male power. Thousands of women were gathered from across the empire to serve the emperor, chosen for beauty and obedience. Wu Zetian understood that institution intimately, because she had once been trapped inside it. She knew its humiliations, its endless rivalries, and the quiet desperation of women whose lives depended entirely on a man's attention. When she became emperor, she did not abolish the system. Instead, she inverted it. Within the private chambers of the palace, a new institution emerged, one that would later become infamous in whispered legends. It was called the Crane Pavilion. Officially, the Crane Pavilion was a cultural and religious institute dedicated to poetry, philosophy, and spiritual study. Its members were presented to the court as scholars, musicians, and ceremonial attendants who served the emperor in artistic matters. In reality, it functioned as something far more controversial. An imperial circle of male companions personally selected for Wu Zetian. These men were chosen with extraordinary care. They were young, physically attractive, and highly intelligent. Some were poets, capable of composing elegant verses on command. Others were musicians whose melodies filled the palace gardens at night. A few were skilled in conversation, able to entertain the emperor with wit and philosophical debate. Yet beauty and charm were not the only qualifications. The men of the Crane Pavilion were also trained observers. Wu Zetian had learned long ago that the most valuable information often came from unexpected places. These men moved freely through the inner chambers of the palace where ministers, eunuchs, and concubines spoke carelessly. They listened. They watched. They carried secrets back to the throne. In that sense, the Crane Pavilion was not simply a circle of lovers. It was an intelligence network hidden behind silk curtains. Among the many men who entered Wu Zetian's orbit, one rose faster than all the others. His name was Zhu Wei. Before entering the palace, he had lived an unremarkable life as a wandering merchant, selling medicines and cosmetics in the markets of the capital. But he possessed something that immediately caught attention. Extraordinary physical presence. Tall, confident, and charismatic. He attracted notice wherever he went. According to court records, he was first introduced to the palace through the recommendation of Princess Taizong, Wu Zetian's own daughter. Once inside the palace walls, Zhu Wei's rise was astonishing. Wu Zetian quickly became fascinated with him. To avoid public scandal, he was officially ordained as a Buddhist monk and given control of important religious institutions. In theory, he had taken vows of spiritual discipline. In practice, he became one of the most powerful men in the empire. Temples were constructed under his supervision, including enormous monuments meant to glorify Wu Zetian as reign and reinforce the idea that her rule was divinely sanctioned. Zhu Wei received military titles despite having no battlefield experience. Officials bowed to him as though he were a prince, but power gained quickly is rarely handled with wisdom. As the years passed, Zhu Wei's arrogance grew. He insulted senior ministers, mocked religious authorities, and behaved with increasing recklessness inside the palace. The man who had once been a useful ally began to see himself as indispensable. Eventually, his pride pushed him beyond the limits even Wu Zetian could tolerate. According to several historical sources, after sensing that the emperor's favor was fading, he committed an act of desperate rage. The magnificent Hall of Light, a massive temple he had helped build to honor Wu Zetian, was set ablaze. Flames consumed the structure and illuminated the capital with a terrifying glow. The message was unmistakable. Zhu Wei believed his influence was powerful enough to survive even such an act of defiance. Was wrong. Within days, he was quietly arrested and executed. His name was erased from official records, and the palace moved on as though he had never existed. In Wu Zetian's world, loyalty was rewarded generously, but betrayal was erased completely. After his fall, other men entered the emperor's circle. Some were musicians, others physicians or scholars who offered companionship rather than political ambition. One such figure was Shen Nanqiu, remembered in certain records as a calm and thoughtful presence in the palace. Unlike Zhu Wei, he did not seek titles or authority. He played music for the emperor, prepared medicines, and remained largely invisible to the political factions of the court. For a time, his quiet loyalty provided Wu Zetian with rare moments of peace. But the final chapter of her reign would be shaped by two men whose influence proved far more dangerous. They were the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizi and Zhang Shangzong. Young, elegant, and strikingly handsome, they entered the palace through the recommendation of Princess Taizong. At first they appeared harmless, entertainers meant to comfort an aging ruler. Yet their rise was swift and dramatic. Wu Zetian trusted them deeply, granting them access to the most private areas of the palace. Over time, the Zhang brothers became gatekeepers of imperial power. Officials who wished to speak with the emperor often had to pass through them first. Documents were filtered, audiences delayed, and decisions quietly influenced behind the scenes. For the Confucian elite of the Tamp's court, this was unbearable humiliation. The idea that two young men without noble lineage could shape imperial policy enraged the old aristocracy. Meanwhile, Wu Zetian herself was growing older. She had ruled with relentless energy for decades, but age and illness began to weaken her. Her eyesight faded, her strength diminished, and the burden of governing an enormous empire grew heavier with each passing year. The Zhang brothers filled the vacuum created by her declining health. They controlled access to her chambers and delivered many of her orders to the outside world. Inside, the palace resentment began to boil. Ministers whispered that the empire was no longer governed by the emperor but by the whims of two ambitious favorites. Military commanders feared instability. Loyalists of the old Tang Dynasty believed the moment had come to restore the traditional order. The final confrontation arrived in the winter of 705. Before dawn one morning, a group of high-ranking officials and generals entered the Forbidden City with armed guards. The palace corridors, usually filled with quiet ceremony, echoed with the sound of armor and hurried footsteps. Their target was not Wu Zetian herself, but the men who controlled her access to power. The Zhang brothers were captured almost immediately. They were dragged from the palace and executed without ceremony. Their heads were displayed publicly as a warning to anyone who might attempt to control the throne from behind the curtains. Only then did the conspirators approach Wu Zetian. She was nearly 80 years old, weakened by illness, but still mentally aware of the political storm unfolding around her. Surrounded by ministers and soldiers, she was presented with a simple demand: abdicate the throne and restore the Tang Dynasty. There was no dramatic battle, no final speech of defiance. After decades of ruling an empire, Wu Zetian placed her seal on the document that ended her reign. She was removed from power and confined to a secondary palace where she lived under quiet supervision. Only a few months later, she died, ending one of the most extraordinary political careers in world history. But death did not end the controversy surrounding her name. The scholars who served the restored Tang Dynasty faced a problem that history itself had created. They could not erase Wu Zetian completely. Her reign had been too long and too transformative. Instead, they reshaped her memory. Confucian historians wrote accounts that emphasized scandal, cruelty, and sexual excess, while minimizing her administrative achievements. The reforms she introduced were often ignored or attributed to male ministers. Her political genius was reduced to personal ambition. Even her tomb became a symbol of this complicated legacy. The massive stone stele that stands at her burial site remains famously blank. No inscription describes her achievements or condemns her actions. For more than 1,000 years, historians have debated whether that silence was her own decision or the final insult of her enemies. Yet the emptiness itself speaks volumes. Wu Zetian remains the only woman in the entire history of China to rule as emperor in her own name. She governed one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, reshaped its institutions, and challenged beliefs that had existed for centuries. Whether she was a visionary ruler or a ruthless opportunist continues to divide historians even today. But one fact is impossible to deny. For a brief moment in the long arc of imperial history, the throne of China belonged not to a son of heaven, but to a woman who refused to accept the limits that history had written for her. And the echoes of that rebellion still disturb the silence of the Forbidden City.